This is True Spies, the podcast that takes you deep inside the greatest secret missions of all time. Week by week, you'll hear the true stories behind the operations that have shaped the world we live in. You'll meet the people who live life undercover. What do they know? What are their skills? And what would you do in their position? I'm Rhiannon Needs, and this is True Spies from SPYSCAPE Studios. An extremely violent year. Nangarhar Province, Afghanistan. It's the summer of 2006, and the Chaprahar Bazaar is in full swing. The humid air thrums with the entreaties of stallholders and the heated theatrics of lifelong hagglers. Pick your way through the general bustle, and your trained eye might alight on two men, deep in conversation. They've come with a very specific purchase in mind, a product which, in this desperately poor nation, represents a livelihood for thousands.
I mean, this is big money, and it's open bazaars where they're trading opium and morphine and heroin all over Afghanistan.
One of the pair is, clearly, no stranger to bazaars like this one. His name is Khan Mohammed, and he moves with the easy bonhomie of a man in his element. Mohammed's companion, for the purposes of this story, is called Jaweed. He's less at ease here, but he's come with serious cash to spend.
You could buy a kilo of heroin for, $2,500 up to maybe $5,000 depending on the year. And then you could sell that same kilo of heroin in the United States for anywhere between like $65,000 and $100,000. And they went through stalls, and Khan Mohammed introduced him to people and then did the negotiating for him to buy 10 kilos as like a sample.
But there's an invisible partner in today's venture, one with motives that go beyond profit.
We had one of our other sources who was in Afghan law enforcement there at the time. So he actually observed the whole thing and took photos for us, and we had audio recordings.
Jaweed, our enterprising buyer, represents their interests. Khan Mohammed, his gregarious guide to the opium business, is none the wiser.
They made a deal with one of them. We'd given Jaweed money, and Jaweed paid that opium dealer a down payment and arranged to pick up the opium later.
The day's trading is over, and everyone leaves happy.
Khan Mohammed, I have him on tape, and this is not an exact quote, but it's roughly saying whether it's by opium or by bullets, we'll kill the infidel.
The story you're about to hear represents a watershed in the way that the United States prosecutes international narco-terrorism.
So narco-terrorism is simply the nexus between narcotics trafficking and terrorism. The most common way that you see that narco-terrorism expressed is really like the symbiotic relationship between terrorist groups and drug traffickers. And you see that all over the world. In Afghanistan, since we're talking about that specifically, you saw that with drug groups that were acting as intelligence gatherers for the terrorists. When terrorists would move from like the federally administered tribal areas into Afghanistan, drug groups would guide them. They would house them. They would store weapons for them. There was just this symbiotic relationship where one would assist the other, whether it was through money, through funding. Drug dealers were required to pay a zakat, which is a religious tax of 10% of what they were making to the terror groups. So they both worked together.
It's time to meet your guide, a man who has contributed more than most to the fight against Afghan narco-terror.
Yeah, I'm Jeffrey James Higgins. I'm a retired supervisory special agent with the Drug Enforcement Administration. I'm also a thriller writer, and I run Elaine's Literary Salon and podcast.
For the men and women who speak to this podcast, a career as a thriller writer is a popular retirement plan. But among them, Jeffrey James Higgins stands alone, because for him, the writing came first.
I started as a journalist, and I was working as a police officer because I really wanted some fodder for my thriller and mystery books. And I was just really taken by this ability to be able to help people.
As it turned out, Jeffrey's new vocation would provide plenty of material.
So I started working for the DEA in New York City. So we were targeting transnational criminal groups, really focused on the violence, Colombian hit crews, people that were gangs that were murdering and terrorizing civilians.
But the attacks on 9/11, as they did for so many of our true spies, put Jeffrey on a different trajectory.
I'll never forget driving down the West Side Highway in New York City and hearing the radio call from NYPD saying that the tower had just come down. Things were very chaotic in New York at the time, and a bunch of agents, I think there were about a dozen of us, just decided we'd go down there and see what we could do to help. So we got together, we left our pager numbers, and we went down to the site. So I remember standing there on this rubble, jets flying overhead, and I just swore that I would find a way to avenge that, and that I would use my investigative powers to go after terrorism. And then I really spent the rest of my career just doing that.
But at that time, the DEA wasn't an official part of America's intelligence community. Terror was not necessarily part of its purview.
So the DEA is a single mission agency. So unlike the FBI that enforces a lot of federal U.S. law, the DEA is focused on drugs and related crimes. People did not want to get pulled into the war on terror because they thought as a single mission agency, they'd get subsumed by the newly formed Department of Homeland Security. So there was a lot of that going on, right? It's both politics, but also some legitimate concern about losing the mission of an agency.
But Jeffrey was determined to bring terrorists to justice. And he knew that his agency had the ability to make a difference.
I did whatever I could to volunteer to get into this battle. So in the days right after 9/11, I joined the Joint Terrorism Task Force, and DEA offered a bunch of investigators. We were doing searches of storage units. So these are commercial, privately owned storage units in the area, because no one knew when the next attack was coming. So the concern was there's a dirty bomb, there's something else that's going to hit New York.
DEA tradecraft, with its heavy emphasis on human sources, turned out to be invaluable.
We'd go into these storage units, and I was looking for behavior from the owners that would raise some suspicion, talking to people privately, developing sources. I found several storage units that were used by Lebanese drug traffickers, and then I was talking to people who knew them and flipping them. And by doing that, by developing human intelligence, which is what DEA is so good at, I found someone who said that they'd been at a party, and this man from the Middle East had been bragging that he'd been driving the hijackers around before the attacks. And so within a few weeks, we were able to locate who this guy was, find the guy's car, interrogate the person who brought him into the country and was working with him. And then the man who'd been driving them around was actually deported. So, he was sent back, unfortunately. But we did that just in a very short amount of time, just using traditional drug enforcement tactics.
As Jeffrey continued his work, he identified no end of crossover between terror suspects and the profitable world of narcotics.
I was at the Department of Homeland Security for a while in their watch center in D.C. as a liaison. But while I was there, all the threats to the U.S. were coming in, and I was running all the names, I was running the phone numbers, I was running the addresses. And what I was finding was DEA had intelligence on most of the terrorism leads that we had. So I was reaching out to our offices and seeing what they could do and dig further in and use the sources that they'd already developed, because there was this stovepiping in the intelligence community between all the intelligence agencies. There's this natural competitiveness. Part of it's if I tell somebody else about this really classified operation that we're doing, it'll be compromised. And so I was trying to knock down those walls, at least from our agency.
Eventually, Jeffrey realized that if he wanted to fight on the front lines, he'd need to go where the action was.
So I kept looking for ways to push my agency into this, and I ended up volunteering to go to Afghanistan. And I got there in early 2004. And I was the assistant country attaché. It was a full-time country attaché. So there were just two of us who were full-time there. When the attaché was out or traveling, which was frequent, I'd be the acting country attaché. So I was representing DEA at the country team meetings, or we'd have, a general from the DOD who's in charge of the theater. We'd have the ambassador, members, the heads of each of these agencies. And so when people would come in, whether they were senators or the drug czar or whatever, we'd brief them.
But even in Kabul, it was an uphill battle to convince other agencies of the DEA's worth in Afghanistan.
And I remember having a conversation once with a very high-level person from the intelligence community. and they were telling me that there's absolutely no proof of like a nexus between drugs and terrorism. And I laid out like 20 cases that we were working on, and 19 of them were related, you know? And they're like, well, that's just anecdotal. It's like, sure it is, but it's everywhere. And also theoretically, it just makes sense. This is where they're making their money. Like every day we were putting out cables, you know, to the entire community saying, this is what we've learned. And most of the information that we were disseminating was counterterrorism information, but it was related to drugs. And that was really the only thing I cared about, you know, having been at 9/11.
This frustration shone a light on the very real differences between agencies with a law enforcement remit and those who concentrate on intelligence gathering.
So like some of our intelligence agencies and I think this is an artifact of the Cold War to some extent. And some of the Cold War mentality is, you know, you develop this intelligence and you can't act on it because the second you do, you compromise your sources. And this is a very distinct difference between like law enforcement intelligence and pure intelligence, where our goal is to actually disrupt and dismantle criminal organizations. So I would often tell people in the intelligence community, they'd have this information or I'd have it and I'd want to use it and they wouldn't want me to. And I'd tell them, you're writing history books because, you know, the intelligence you have is fantastic, but if we don't act on it, what are we doing with it, you know? So our goal was purely to put people in jail, take them off of the battlefield.
At first, that wasn't easy.
I mean, literally, we were opening an office. We had no resources. Like, I just didn't have the gear from DEA. So it took DEA a few years to really say, oh, we're operating in a war zone. This is something we need to step our game up a little bit.
In time, the DEA's presence in Afghanistan grew in both scale and impact.
So I was there April 2004, and I worked till roughly June or July of 2005, where we were there slowly growing. I think we were up to like 10 or 12 agents. At some point, the Kabul country office with agents grew to like over 100, including like the air wing and the analysts. Like it grew to, we had a new base away from the embassy in the north part of Kabul by the airport. You know, so it grew into a very big thing.
In 2005, the DEA established Foreign Advisory Support Teams in Afghanistan, FAST teams for short.
These were DEA's foreign tactical teams, and I was a member of the first group. So our first FAST teams came in, I believe it was April of 2005, and I was the acting country attaché when they arrived. Like January, February 2005, I went to Fort Benning and I did training with our first FAST teams. We had military training, and then I deployed with them later that year. So we had, you know, advanced military weapons. We had machine guns. We had grenade launchers. We trained with, you know, special operations from the, you know, SEALs to everybody.
Even with all that firepower, there are very few places in the world where an American DEA agent can make an arrest directly.
So when we're making an arrest in a foreign country, it's the foreign police department, the foreign military, whoever it is, our foreign partners that are making the arrest. And then we're looking at prosecuting when we can in the United States. And often countries will insist on doing prosecutions within their country, and we fully support that. You know, you just want to take the bad actors off the battlefield so they can stop killing people.
But on those occasions when the DEA wants to bring international suspects back to the States to stand trial, there are two primary laws called long-arm statutes that they rely upon.
One is 21 U.S.C. 959, and that's if somebody overseas wants to violate U.S. law by bringing drugs into the country. You know, these are major traffickers looking to import. So if they're bringing in drugs to the U.S. in violation of U.S. law, we're able to arrest them even if they're overseas. Using a foreign police department, we can arrest them, then we can bring them back, indict them, and charge them in the United States, whether that's through like a judicial removal or through a formal extradition.
The second law came into effect during Jeffrey's FAST team deployments.
Largely based on the information that we were providing in Afghanistan about the nexus between narcotics and terrorism.
It's called 21 U.S.C. 960A, but generally it goes by something more memorable.
That's, you know, familiarly known as the narco-terrorism law. And that's essentially if anyone is violating these U.S. narcotics, federal narcotics laws, and then providing anything of a pecuniary value to a terrorist organization.
In other words, if you're a drug organization with terror links, you've been put on notice.
Congress passes 21 U.S.C. 960 in early 2006. So this was just a few months before this case. So when my FAST team deployed, our goal was let's see if we can find that initial person to charge with this and set the precedent.
And that's where Khan Mohammed enters the picture.
So Khan Mohammed was a member of the Taliban, and he was also an opium and heroin trafficker in the Nangarhar province of Afghanistan. And Nangarhar is one of the more criminal provinces, with a higher criminal element within it, because it's on the border with the federally administered tribal areas in Pakistan, and it has like the Khyber Pass.
Until 2018, Pakistan's federally administered tribal area was a semi-autonomous region. And at the time that this story takes place, a hotbed of Taliban activity.
It has some major traditional smuggling routes. So there's like 7 or 8 major passes that go through the mountains south of the Khyber Pass in Nangarhar.
Khan Mohammed's corner of Nangarhar was the Chaprahar district,
which is sort of in the shadow of the Spingar, the White Mountain, which is where Tora Bora is, where Osama bin Laden hid after the U.S. invasion.
Jeffrey had a source who had dealt with Khan Mohammed years before in his capacity as an opium trader. In the middle of 2006, that source recruited a sub-source.
I swear, you could drop a DEA agent on the moon and they'd somehow develop a human source network. You know, we'd go in there, we'd find somebody we could work with, and often through like our Foreign Service nationals or somebody they'd heard of, they'd tell us information. They'd find someone, a relation, somebody they trusted, somebody who needed money, somebody who was like, you know, they're going to blow up a girls' school, you know, and I don't want this to happen. Like, just some people who are very purely motivated as well. And then you work your way up, whether they're being paid or they're doing it for whatever reason, they're now on the team, you know, and if that ever gets out, they'll be killed. So they're sort of part of it, and then you can get them to help recruit other people.
This new subsource brought the DEA troubling news.
He'd been tasked by the Taliban to acquire rockets to attack the Jalalabad airfield. It was a commercial airfield originally, and then after the war, it became a military base. That
subsource's name was Jaweed.
And so Jaweed was a farmer in the southern part, in the Chaprahar area of southern Nangarhar, and he was tasked with finding missiles. And Jaweed came to us and said, "I don't want to do this. What do I do?"
What indeed?
We told him to go ahead with it, and we would document it and try to take out the largest targets within this organization that we could.
The DEA knew that Jaweed was just a pawn in a much bigger game, but he might offer a route to a more valuable player, the Taliban's point man in Chaprahar, Khan Mohammed, someone who was far too important to go out rustling up missiles himself. Above Khan Mohammed was a Taliban commander by the name of Abdul Rahman,
who was residing in Pakistan and who was directing operations against coalition forces in the Nangarhar province in Afghanistan.
Abdul Rahman, in turn, answered to Habib Z,
who was a former Taliban official who ran a vast network of Taliban insurgency from Pakistan in Afghanistan. So we'd seized landmines and weapons and drugs, and so we'd been looking at this guy for a couple of years. So the goal, is to build a prosecutable case against the Habib Z and Mullah Abdul Rahman and identify who are their cells that they have within the Nangarhar province.
Which, in Nangarhar, was no easy feat for an American.
It's really difficult when you're in like these austere environments to put together like what we think of in the West, right? These prosecutable cases where you have witnesses, you have physical evidence, you have surveillance photos. For the most part, American forces were stuck on these forward operating posts, right? So we didn't have the ability to project power in a lot of ways except for through military action.
So the DEA relied on a vast network of friendly Afghan nationals to facilitate their work.
We couldn't operate without them, right? So these were Afghans working under the auspice of like the U.S. Embassy, and they spoke the language. They were able to get us what we need. They were fixers.
Only when an in-person meeting was absolutely necessary would Jeffrey's team venture off base.
We put on Afghan clothing, the pacols and the clothes, and over like our bulletproof vests, we'd have our guns, and we'd rent local cars through our Foreign Service nationals, so they were doing it undercover. And then we'd drive outside the base, and we'd go meet our sources, like in places around Afghanistan where it was just us. And if we got into trouble, we had radios we could call and hope somebody would come and try to help us out. But that was really the only way you could do it, because trying to meet sources within the bases. I mean, it was really difficult not to compromise sources. To try to bring in people inside a base raises the level of compromise or potential for compromise. So we'd go out and we'd interview them outside.
This was how the FAST team stayed in touch with Jaweed as he undertook his dangerous search for the Taliban's rockets. But the DEA aims to convict criminals, not simply gather intelligence. So they needed hard evidence of Khan Mohammed's intent to use the weapons against coalition forces, which meant that Jaweed would need to be wired for sound.
And we did all this through recordings. So we'd use micro recorders and have them on our source, so we could at least hear what the conversations were, even if we couldn't observe them ourselves. And we'd use various types of listening devices. There's devices we could use from a distance. There are things we could put on them. There's things we could put in objects. There's a lot of different technological devices that we have to use for this.
Wearing a wire is nerve-wracking, even for a trained law enforcement officer in the West. But in Afghanistan, the consequences of discovery were amplified tenfold.
When you're putting a recorder on somebody, you're asking them to literally risk their lives. One of the top Taliban in the Nangarhar province at that time was this guy who went by Maftoon. He was known as the Mountain Poet. And he carried a sword, and when he'd go into these villages, if anyone had been cooperating with the Afghan government, he'd cut their hands off. So this was what they were up against. So being caught with a recorder by one of your targets means death. And so they knew that.
Even so, Jaweed held his nerve.
Jaweed, through one of our sources, was able to locate a weapons trafficker in the Nangarhar province who was supplying weapons, and we actually acquired the weapons. Khan Mohammed asked Jaweed to bring the missiles to his house, and they were going to bury them in his yard in preparation for Mullah Abdul Rahman to come into Nangarhar and lead the attack.
But don't worry, Khan Mohammed never got his hands on those missiles.
We couldn't give them to Khan Mohammed because we were afraid once we lost control of these missiles, they could be used against us. And even if they weren't launched, they could be used as improvised explosives. And we saw that quite a bit. So we had our police source and Jaweed bring the missiles to us. So my partner and I and our Afghan Foreign Service national went out into the middle of nowhere, and we were parked by a riverbed. And these guys came and brought the missiles in the middle of the night, and we had to put them in our truck and cover them up and then drive them back and hope we didn't blow ourselves up.
Luckily, the Taliban mullah didn't smell a rat. Or if he did, he wasn't willing to risk his neck by kicking up a fuss.
We had to have Jaweed tell him that the missiles had been stolen, and he was irate, and he was talking about, well, we were not going to tell Mullah Abdul Rahman because he'll go crazy, we'll be in trouble. Just get more missiles and we'll find a way to pay for them. We had the missiles. We had him on tape talking about burying the missiles at his house. We had him talking about the attacks on the airfield.
Even so, the DEA was still missing the narco in narco-terrorism.
We knew we wanted to arrest Khan Mohammed, but we also wanted to work up the chain. So we decided that we had to show the drug nexus, because he was one of those terrorists who was also a drug trafficker. He started as a drug trafficker and then was a Taliban official, right?
And time is of the essence.
So this was 2006. It was roughly June through October we did this. So when I was on those fast teams, we do these 4-month deployments. So we had to do cases fairly quickly. Then another team would come in to replace us.
A new team would mean new handlers for Jaweed, and Jeffrey didn't want to risk his operation losing momentum in the handover. He needed Jaweed to gather proof that Khan Mohammed and his Taliban superiors had a hand in the drugs trade.
We decided to start with an opium purchase. We wanted to just get 10 kilos of opium to see if this worked and to prove that Khan Mohammed was a drug trafficker. We had Jaweed went to Khan Mohammed and said, I want to purchase opium. And Khan Mohammed took him to the Chaprahar Bazaar. And these are open bazaars filled, and it's both drug and other, commercial items.
Which is where we found Khan Mohammed and Jaweed at the start of this episode, perusing the bazaar for a deal, all under the watchful eye of another DEA source.
We worked with the Afghan National Interdiction Unit, so we had our own Afghan police officers that we'd use as an enforcement arm. We did surveillance ourselves, we watched deals ourselves, but for this one we couldn't, so we had to rely on our sources and audio-video recording.
Jaweed had made a down payment and arranged collection for a later date. And it's worth mentioning that this is not how the DEA usually does business.
DEA, as part of our policy, we don't front money like in the United States. If we give a source money, they're supposed to wait, have the drugs, give the money, right? You show me yours. No, you show me yours, that type of thing. But overseas in these cultures, it doesn't work like that.
When in Afghanistan, do as the Afghans do.
Not how the Afghans did business. So we had to improvise a little bit with that. But there's always the worry, you give somebody money and they don't provide. Now you've just lost this money, which it causes, issues within the agency.
And for a moment, it looked like that's exactly what would happen.
So Khan Mohammed was going to pick up the opium from this opium trafficker in the Chaparral district, and this is what happens in a war zone. There was military activity, and there was an operation going on, so they couldn't get to it.
But Khan Mohammed trusts Joeid, or his wallet, anyway. And the mullah makes the deal work.
Eventually, Khan Mohammed got the opium, gave it to Joeid, and then we used one of our police sources to meet him, collect the recording device when they had done the drug transaction, and then bring the opium to us.
Time for another undercover outing for the FAST team.
So my partner and I, put on our Afghan clothing and we went out into the hinterlands and we found a place in the middle of nowhere and we did the exchange and we were able to collect the evidence.
The DEA was closing in on Khan Mohammed, but there was still some way to go before the case against him would be rock solid.
So we had the missiles, we had an opium deal, but to charge someone under our long-arm statutes, like 21 U.S.C. 959, for example, we have certain thresholds, and then 10 kilos of opium wouldn't cut it. So we had Joeid meet with Khan Mohammed again and tell him that he wanted to buy 2 kilos of heroin.
Joeid made it clear that he had big plans for those kilos. Plans that were music to the Taliban's ears.
He told him the heroin was going to a friend of his who ran an international drug trafficking organization, and that organization was sending the kilos to New York. I think he said Washington and New York. And Khan Mohammed expressed enthusiasm that we were going to be able to kill more infidels doing this. So we ordered 2 kilos of heroin and then went through a very similar process where we wired Joeid up. And this time, we wired him up with audio and video. So we have video of Joeid walking to Khan Mohammed's house, being greeted, going inside. Khan Mohammed brings out the kilos of heroin, opens them up, and then inspects them for him and tests the heroin to make sure it's high enough quality, talking to him about the economics of it and talking about where the drugs are going. So after we got the heroin, we did some more conversations about bringing drugs to America, and this was only the beginning, and we were going to do much larger loads.
At this point, you might be thinking that this sounds a bit like overkill, but Jeffrey and the DEA weren't interested in taking any chances when this case came to trial.
The difference between entrapment, where you're getting someone to do something they haven't done before, and a good solid evidence for a prosecution is you have to show their history. So Khan Mohammed on tape talked about his history of selling drugs. And that was really critical to us to show that we weren't making him do something he'd never done before. And then we have him on tape talking about killing Americans, attacking the Jalalabad airfield and working for the Taliban. And we have an opium deal because he's talking about how he's been dealing opium and heroin for so many years, and now we have him inspecting opium and facilitating this drug purchase. And then they talked about on tape using the proceeds from these drug purchases to then buy weapons to commit the attacks.
This evidence meant that Jeffrey could leverage the US government's long-arm narco-terror statutes to the greatest extent possible.
And this is where the sort of novel legal approach came to me, that we don't even need to show him giving the money to the Taliban. He can just be using it for himself. And this was later affirmed by a higher court because it just sort of makes common sense, right? Whether you're doing the attack yourself or giving it to that guy to do the attack, you're still using the drug money to do the attack. And it's providing anything of pecuniary value to a terrorist organization or to someone engaged in terrorist activities.
Khan Mohammed certainly fit that bill. He was a walking nexus between drugs and terror, the kind that Jeffrey James Higgins had been trying to establish for years.
We checked all the boxes on this one. It was important because even in 2006, we were still having the arguments about the nexus between drugs and terrorism. And I had one of the biggest drug traffickers in the world on tape giving a speech to these farmers talking about how it was their religious obligation to grow poppies, to create opium, to kill the infidels.
The time had come to move in on Khan Mohammed, preferably without a fight. But in Nangarhar, subtlety was a luxury.
Yeah, so then we were deciding how we were going to arrest him. And when you're in a distant, border town, how do you get there? We were going to have to do it by helicopter, but a lot of these Taliban members, they'll have lookouts. As soon as they hear a helicopter, they hear an airplane, they hear a drone, they all go into hiding. We were trying to do it with a convoy so we could go in at night and then set up and then hit them very quickly in the morning at first light. And we just couldn't get permissions to go down there because of the 2006 was an extremely violent year, and the area that we were in had seen so much Taliban combat that we couldn't get permission to take our guys down there.
Luckily, Jeffrey was able to lean on his network of human sources and his deep understanding of Afghanistan's tribal politics to effect a quieter kind of arrest.
So we worked with a local police official. Khan Mohammed had been a member of the Shinwari sub-tribe. So it's a Pashtun sub-tribe in that area. And he was one of the elders who handled some of their tribal problems. So we brought him on a ruse up to Jalalabad with a police official to ostensibly have this meeting with the governor so he could talk about some of these issues. And we set up a control checkpoint using our National Interdiction Unit Afghan officers, because, again, we can't make the arrest, right? And when he came up, we stopped the car like a normal checkpoint and then arrested him.
Khan Mohammed was spirited away to the Jalalabad airfield, the very complex he'd so recently plotted to destroy, with missiles paid for by the drugs trade.
We brought him back to the Jalalabad airfield, and we had vetted him with the U.S. military. So they had declared him, based on our intelligence and the vetting package, they declared him as an enemy combatant. So they held him. We interrogated him. He made a lot of incriminating statements and a lot of lies. And often you don't need a suspect to say, yes, I did this. You just have to show that what they're saying is a lie, and that's a way for you to show deception to a jury.
The audio and video, courageously gathered by Jaweed, turned out to be invaluable during Khan Mohammed's interrogation.
He was admitting that the pictures and the video I had of him were him, but he was saying the voice wasn't his. So I was playing him audio recordings and saying, well, what about here when you said this? He's like, that's not my voice. So I had my computer facing me and I played him the one where he did the 2 kilos of heroin, where he provided them to Jaweed. And I said, well, what about that? He's like, well, that's not my voice. So I turned the video around and I showed him, he was on video while he was saying those words, as like an interrogation tactic. So the video is something you can play for a jury, and you get stills of Khan Mohammed holding the kilos. It's very compelling evidence in a lot of ways. And when you have Khan Mohammed in his own voice talking about killing Americans and blowing people up, it's really hard for him to find a strong defense for that.
Then there was the question of the trial. For Jeffrey, it was imperative that Khan Mohammed face justice in the USA. Remember, one of the main points of this operation was to establish a precedent for the recently passed narco-terrorism statute, 21 U.S.C. 960.
And also, there was so much corruption in Afghanistan at the time that a lot of times the higher level people that we arrested were released from jail.
While the legal wrangling went on, and with their suspect safely in custody, the DEA's eyes turned to Khan Mohammed's compound.
We put together an airborne operation, and we went in with our National Interdiction Unit. We were using Department of State, INL, that's sort of their international narcotics team. We were using their UH-1 Huey helicopters, and we flew in, we assaulted the complex, and we were able to gather a bunch more evidence while we were there.
The final nails in an expensive coffin.
We brought him back with the blessing of the Afghan government to Washington, D.C., and we tried him there. Jaweed came along with some very brave Afghan law enforcement officers, and they testified against him. They were able to authenticate the things he said. They were able to authenticate, because you need someone to show the videos. You need someone to say, how did we get these recordings? They were able to authenticate that, and we got a very quick conviction.
In December 2008, Khan Mohammed was sentenced to 2 life sentences on drugs and narco-terrorism charges. The DEA had their precedent, and a dangerous extremist had been taken off the board. But this story doesn't come with anything like a happy ending. Which brings us to Jawed, the Afghan farmer whose efforts had played a crucial role in the DEA's success.
Right after the arrest, we had moved Jawed and his family out of that area because there's a small town controlled by the Taliban. He would have been killed instantly. So we moved him to another part of Afghanistan. Ideally, you'd like to move someone to another country, but when you're like uneducated, illiterate, you've only lived in this small Afghan town for a very long time. It's in some ways it's not feasible to like bring you to the West, right? In some ways you're just not going to thrive. So we talked to him a lot about that, but we moved him to another part of Afghanistan where he should have been safe. And then against our direction, he went back to the Chaprahar district for like a distant relative's wedding. He was in a car, he was driving up a hill, and the Taliban were lying in wait, and they jumped out and riddled the car with small arms fire and killed him.
Whether the US government could or should have done more to protect their source in this individual case is a question for another podcast. But on the macro level, Jeffrey James Higgins believes that the US government's 2021 withdrawal from the Afghan theatre was mishandled and left their allies without a fighting chance.
Our withdrawal happened during the fighting season, right? So if we just waited a few months till the passes were snowed in, Afghanistan could have had a break to understand we were leaving and reconfigure their defense forces. We'd set up Afghanistan with all these small outposts that were supplied by air as a way to control the country as a whole. And when we left so quickly that there were Afghan military units that didn't have fuel for planes, they didn't have ammunition, they didn't have food. The entire logistical structure for a military is a big part of how militaries operate. We basically yanked that out because when we left, we also pulled our contractors with us. And they were begging for more time to be able to find new contractors, to be able to replace what we were doing. And we just pulled out too quickly, and the Taliban just swept across the country and took charge.
And the restored Taliban government hadn't forgotten about Khan Mohammed. In the intervening decade, he'd made a few appeals against his conviction, some of which were successful, reducing his term to a single life sentence. But life is life, and he was still going nowhere. Until...
In 2025, right at the end of the Joe Biden presidential administration, they traded Khan Mohammed back to the Taliban for 2 American citizens that the Taliban had been detaining. I'm really glad we got 2 American citizens back. I think that's a wonderful outcome, but it's a really horrible precedent to set because it just encourages further hostage taking.
Since returning to power, the Taliban have reportedly enforced a swinging ban on opium production inside their territory, decimating the global supply of heroin. We'll discuss that move and its impacts on the wider narcotics trade in an upcoming subscribers-only debrief with Jeffrey. If you'd like to hear it, subscribe to SPYSCAPE Plus at plus.spyscape.com and keep your eyes peeled. In the meantime, why not pick up a good book?
So I retired in 2017, and I've been a full-time writer. I've written 15 books. 7 of them are out right now, and I've got a few in the pipeline. Well, for people who are watching this, they probably enjoy my espionage series. I do both suspense and thriller. So I have psychological suspense and techno-thrillers and things. But the Nathan Burke series, it starts with the Havana Syndrome. That was picked by Library Journal as one of the best books of 2025. And there's 4 books in that series, and each one deals with a different geopolitical issue. There's a Khorasan Retribution, which is about an Afghan Foreign Service national left behind in Afghanistan. The China Gambit deals with Chinese unrestricted warfare. And then the Uganda Protocol is the 4th of that series. So I'd recommend people start with the Havana Syndrome. It had great reviews.
I'm Rhiannon Needs. Join us next time for another rendezvous with true spies. Disclaimer. The views expressed in this podcast are those of the subject. These stories are told from their perspective, and their authenticity should be assessed on a case-by-case basis. If you're enjoying this podcast, please click now to give it a 5-star rating or leave a review. Ratings and reviews help people discover the podcast and help us bring you more great stories. And if you have some time, why not forward the podcast to a friend?